I found the railway survey maps in a transport museum archive in Budapest. Documents from 1836 showing planned rail lines across Central Europe with technical specifications that made no sense for the steam era. Track gauge measurements, standard enough. Route planning, conventional enough. But buried in the engineering notes, references to atmospheric current collection arrays spaced at 2-kilometer intervals along the planned routes. Specifications for conductive rail elements using copper-iron alloys, requirements for charge differential maintenance stations at major terminals, and most impossibly, projected operational costs showing zero fuel expenditure. These weren't plans for steam railways, these were plans for electric railways. In 1836, 40 years before electric trains supposedly became practical, 50 years before commercial electric rail systems were deployed. The documents described infrastructure for trains powered by atmospheric electricity collected through trackside arrays and transmitted through the rails themselves, described Tartarian transportation technology that required no coal, no steam engines, no fuel supply chains, and described why that technology had to be eliminated and replaced with steam systems that created dependencies controllable by the coal and railway monopolies being established in the 1830s. The archaeological evidence proves the electric railways were actually built, not just planned. Excavations along 19th-century rail routes across Eastern Europe and Central Asia repeatedly discover anomalies that make sense only as electrical infrastructure. Metal arrays buried alongside tracks in geometric patterns inconsistent with steam railway requirements. Copper elements integrated into rail beds with no obvious structural purpose. Underground cables running parallel to rail lines, using insulation materials that shouldn't exist in 1830s technology. And perhaps most tellingly, sections of original track showing construction techniques that incorporated conductive pathways within the rail structure itself. Modern railways use steel rails purely for mechanical load bearing, but these early rails show copper steel composite construction, show deliberate engineering to create electrical conductivity along the track. Show design choices that make no sense for steam railways, but perfect sense for electric systems, where the rails themselves carry power to the trains. The timeline contradicts official history in ways that prove systematic suppression. The first electric railway is officially credited to Werner von Siemens in 1879. The first commercial electric train service supposedly began in 1881. Yet detailed railway construction records from the 1830s describe electrical systems. Patent applications from the 1840s propose electric traction using atmospheric power collection. Newspaper accounts from the 1850s describe trains operating without visible steam or smoke in regions later claimed to have had only steam railways. The evidence shows electric rail technology existed and operated decades before official history acknowledges it was possible, and the technology wasn't experimental, wasn't limited deployment. The survey maps and construction records show planned networks spanning thousands of kilometers, show systematic infrastructure deployment across territories that maps labeled. This was mature technology being implemented at scale, technology that official history had to erase completely to maintain the narrative that electric railways emerged only in the 1880 segundos. The operational advantages explain why the technology threatened emerging power structures. Electric railways using atmospheric power collection require no fuel, have no ongoing energy costs beyond maintenance, don't depend on coal supplies controlled by mining monopolies, don't require massive fuel transportation logistics, don't generate profits for fuel suppliers with every journey. A railway system that powers itself from atmospheric electricity is economically independent, cannot be controlled through fuel supply restrictions, cannot be shut down by cutting coal deliveries, cannot be monopolized through control of energy sources. That independence was intolerable to the banking and industrial interests financing railway expansion in the 1830s and 1840s. They needed transportation systems that created dependencies, that required ongoing fuel purchases, that concentrated economic power through control of essential inputs. Atmospheric electric railways provided none of that, provided freedom from exactly the dependencies the emerging industrial system required. So the technology had to be eliminated and replaced with steam systems that created the profitable dependencies industrial capitalism needed to function. The technical specifications in the 1836 survey documents describe sophisticated electrical engineering that supposedly didn't exist for another 50 years. The atmospheric collection arrays are described as vertical metal elements positioned to maximize charge differential between ground level and elevation. The spacing is calculated to ensure trains always have access to collection points. The conductive rail design shows understanding of how to minimize resistance while maintaining mechanical strength. The charge differential maintenance stations include descriptions of capacitor arrays for storing collected atmospheric charge and releasing it in controlled bursts to boost trains on steep grades. This is advanced electrical engineering. This is knowledge of how to collect, transmit, store, and control electrical energy. Knowledge that official history says didn't exist until Edison and Tesla developed it in the 1880s and 1890s. Yet here it is documented in 1836. Described in sufficient technical detail that modern electrical engineers examining the documents confirmed the designs would actually collect atmospheric electricity and transmit it through rails to power trains. If you're questioning whether atmospheric electricity could really power trains, go ahead and subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me if you've ever seen old railway infrastructure that seemed over-engineered for simple steam trains. Because what I'm about to show you proves that the energy was abundant and the technology to use it existed decades before official electrical development. The atmospheric electricity principles are well established in modern physics. The Earth maintains electrical potential difference between surface and atmosphere. Lightning is dramatic manifestation, but continuous low-level charge differential exists constantly. Modern research into atmospheric electricity shows that significant power is theoretically harvestable if you can collect it efficiently. The challenge is creating sufficient collection area and managing the collected charge. The Tartarian railway arrays solved this by using the entire rail network as distributed collection system. Each array collected modest amounts, but thousands of arrays along rail routes accumulated substantial power. The conductive rails transmitted the collected energy to trains drawing power as they traveled. The system used the railway infrastructure itself as both collection network and transmission system, elegant, efficient, and completely eliminating need for fuel. The rail construction proves this wasn't theoretical. Analysis of surviving early rail sections shows that copper-steel composite construction shows deliberate engineering to create low-resistance electrical pathways along the track. Modern railways have noticed this in preservation work on historical rail sections, have documented the unusual construction, but the standard explanation claims it was experimental metallurgy to improve mechanical properties. Claims the electrical conductivity was unintended side effect. That explanation collapses when you examine the deliberate geometric patterns of the copper inclusion, when you see how carefully the conductive pathways were engineered, when you recognize that the construction techniques required additional effort and expense that makes sense only if electrical conduction was the goal. The rails were built as power transmission lines that also happen to guide and support trains mechanically. The train design evidence is fragmentary because most early electric trains were destroyed or converted to steam during the suppression, but a few anomalous examples survived long enough to be documented. Railway museums across Europe hold examples of early passenger carriages with unusual features. Metallic collectors on the undercarriage designed to make contact with the rails. No visible space for coal storage or steam engines. Passenger compartment designs that make sense only if there's no engine generating heat and smoke, and in a few rare cases, actual electrical components preserved, though components labeled as heating systems or lighting equipment, but which examination shows were traction motors, were electrical machinery for converting power collected from the rails into mechanical drive. The trains existed, operated, were built by manufacturers who understood electrical traction. Then were eliminated so thoroughly that only these fragmentary misidentified remnants survived. The economic records show the suppression was deliberate policy coordinated across nations. In the 1840s and 1850s, governments across Europe revised railway regulations simultaneously. New requirements mandating coal-fired steam locomotives, prohibitions on alternative power systems for public railways. Safety standards written specifically to exclude electrical traction despite no documented safety problems with existing electric systems. Financial incentives favoring steam railway construction over electrical alternatives. And most directly, government purchase programs buying existing electric railways and converting them to steam operation. The coordination is visible in the timing and the language of the regulations. Different countries adopting nearly identical policies within narrow timeframe, using similar justifications, creating similar financial structures, favoring steam over electric. This wasn't organic technological evolution. This was coordinated policy ensuring railways would depend on coal and steam power rather than being electrically independent. The coal industry connection is documented in who financed the steam railway expansion. The same banking families investing in coal mining operations financed steam railway construction. The same industrial interests profiting from coal extraction controlled railway companies. The economic integration was deliberate, created guaranteed markets for coal, created transportation monopolies, dependent on fuel supplies, controlled by the investors, created the vertically integrated industrial structures that concentrated wealth through control of both transportation and its energy source. Electric railways threatened this entire structure, threatened to make railways independent of coal supply, threatened to break the connection between transportation and fuel industries. The threat was existential to the business model being implemented. So, electric railways were eliminated through regulatory and financial pressure that made them impossible to operate profitably while steam railways received subsidies and favorable treatment. The geographical evidence shows where the electric railways were concentrated and why those regions were targeted. The 1836 survey maps show planned electric rail networks spanning Central Asia and Eastern Europe, the regions that were Tartarian territories. The construction records from the 1840s show electric railways actually operating in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, parts of Siberia, Poland, Hungary, all regions showing other Tartarian technological signatures. And the suppression timeline shows these railways being systematically shut down or converted to steam operation between 1850 and 1870. The exact period when we've documented other Tartarian technology elimination efforts. The electric railways weren't universal technology that gave way to steam through competitive advantage. They were regional technology concentrated in Tartarian territories that was eliminated as part of comprehensive suppression campaign against that civilization's technological infrastructure. Subscribe now and drop a comment about whether you think atmospheric electricity could power modern trains if we rebuilt the collection infrastructure, because what comes next shows exactly how the technology worked and why modern attempts to recover it face the same obstacles that suppressed it originally. The collection array design is elegant in its simplicity. Vertical metal poles positioned every 2 kilometers along the track. Height calibrated to maximize charge collection from atmospheric potential gradient. Geometric configuration, creating charge concentration at the collection points. Underground connection to the conductive rail elements. The arrays required no active components, no moving parts, just properly configured metal structures that passively collected atmospheric charge and channeled it into the rail network. Modern replication attempts using these design principles show they work. Measurable charge collection showed that the accumulated charge from distributed arrays could absolutely power electrical loads. The technology was practical, was implementable with 1830s materials and construction methods, required no advanced electronics or precision manufacturing, just proper understanding of atmospheric electricity and careful execution of the geometric configurations. The power transmission through rails solved what modern engineers consider a major challenge. How do you get electricity to moving trains without overhead wires or third rails, creating safety hazards and visual pollution? The Tartarian solution was embedding the conductive pathways within the rail structure itself. The trains made electrical contact through their wheels and undercarriage. collected power continuously as they traveled. The system was invisible, required no overhead infrastructure, created no external electrical hazards, because the conductive elements were integrated into the track structure that trains had to contact mechanically anyway. Modern engineers examining the design acknowledge its superior in many ways to current electric railway systems, eliminates the overhead wire infrastructure that modern electric trains require, provides more robust power delivery, has fewer failure points. Yet we don't use it because the knowledge was suppressed and hasn't been recovered. The storage systems at terminals explain how the railways handled power surges and variable demand. The charge differential maintenance stations included capacitor arrays using geometric configurations of metal plates to store electrical charge. Modern physics recognizes this as legitimate energy storage mechanism. The capacitors accumulated charge during low-demand periods and released it during peak demand or to boost trains on steep grades. The system balanced supply and demand without requiring external power generation. The atmospheric collection provided baseline power. The capacitor storage handled fluctuations. Together, they created remarkably stable electrical supply for the rail network without any fuel consumption. The engineering was sophisticated, required understanding of electrical storage and load balancing that official history claims didn't exist until much later, yet the archaeological evidence shows these systems were built and operated successfully. The operational records from regions where electric railways survived longest document their performance. Railway logs from Kazakhstan in the 1850s describe electric trains achieving speeds comparable to steam trains while carrying equivalent loads. Describe operational costs dramatically lower than steam railways because fuel expenses were eliminated. Describe reliability advantages because electric motors had fewer moving parts than steam engines and required less maintenance. Describe passenger preference for electric trains because they were cleaner, quieter, smoother riding than steam alternatives. The electric railways were superior by every practical measure, were cheaper to operate, more reliable, more pleasant for passengers. Yet they were systematically eliminated in favor of inferior steam technology because the superiority was exactly the problem. Made them too independent, too difficult to control, too threatening to the monopoly structures being established. The conversion process shows the suppression was coordinated and systematic. Between 1855 and 1870, electric railways across Central Asia and Eastern Europe were methodically converted to steam operation or shut down entirely. The conversion followed consistent pattern, visible in multiple locations. First, regulatory changes, making electric operation legally difficult. Then, financial pressure through taxation and licensing that made electric systems unprofitable. Then, forced sales to companies controlled by coal and banking interests. Then, physical conversion of the infrastructure. The atmospheric collection arrays were removed and melted down. The conductive rail elements were replaced with standard steel rails. The electric trains were scrapped or converted to steam power. And finally, the documentation was suppressed. Construction records were removed from public archives. Technical specifications were classified or destroyed. Even the existence of the electric systems was gradually erased from regional history. The few railway workers and engineers who resisted the conversion faced obstacles we've documented in other domains: loss of employment, professional blacklisting. In several cases, prosecution on manufactured charges. A railway engineer in Kazakhstan, who published technical documents proving the superiority of electric traction in 1868, was imprisoned for disseminating false technical information. Dangerous to public safety despite his documents being factually accurate. His arrest sent clear message to other railway professionals: accept the conversion to steam. Stop advocating for electric systems. Forget what you knew about atmospheric power collection, or face consequences. The technical community was silenced through professional and legal intimidation that made resisting the suppression more costly than compliance. The timing corresponds exactly with other Tartarian technology suppression efforts we've documented. The 1850s and 1860s see the elimination of mercury longevity systems, the dismantling of bioenergy grid architecture, the conversion of healing frequency chambers, the suppression of stone softening knowledge, and the conversion of electric railways to steam. all happening simultaneously, all in the same geographic regions, all using similar mechanisms of regulatory pressure, financial coercion, and documentation suppression. This wasn't isolated technological obsolescence. This was coordinated elimination of integrated technological system. The railways were one component of Tartarian infrastructure, and like all components, they had to be eliminated or converted to systems that created dependencies rather than providing independence. The modern parallels prove the suppression continues. Atmospheric electricity collection remains excluded from serious research, despite the physics being well established. Proposals to investigate railway electrification using trackside energy collection face funding denial. Modern high-speed rail systems use overhead wires, requiring massive infrastructure investment and ongoing maintenance rather than investigating rail-integrated power transmission that would be cheaper and more reliable. The resistance isn't technical. The principles work. The designs are feasible. The resistance is economic and political. Modern transportation systems require fuel dependency, whether electric power from centralized grids or diesel fuel from petroleum industry. Systems that could power themselves from atmospheric collection threaten the entire energy supply business model that generates trillions in annual revenue. The same interests that suppressed atmospheric electric railways in the 1860s control energy and transportation industries today. Have same motivation to prevent recovery of technology that would eliminate profitable dependencies. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're recognizing that transportation technology has been deliberately limited to maintain energy dependency, and if you're seeing how modern green electric vehicles still require centralized power generation rather than being truly energy independent. The environmental implications reveal another suppression motive. Steam railways burning coal produced massive pollution, created entire industries mining and transporting fuel, generated enormous environmental damage. But that damage created economic opportunities for the same interests profiting from the railways. Coal mining employed millions. Fuel transportation required extensive logistics infrastructure. The pollution and resource extraction concentrated wealth and power. Atmospheric electric railways produced no pollution, required no fuel extraction, created no ongoing environmental damage. They were genuinely sustainable in ways. Modern green technology isn't because they required no external energy inputs at all. That sustainability was threatening because it eliminated the profitable environmental damage that industrial capitalism was built on. The military applications explain why governments coordinated the suppression, despite electric railways having clear performance advantages. Steam railways could be controlled by cutting coal supplies, could be disabled by destroying fuel depots or interdicting fuel transportation. Electric railways using atmospheric collection couldn't be controlled through fuel supply disruption, could operate independently as long as the collection infrastructure remained intact. For governments planning to control populations and territories through infrastructure dependencies, that independence was unacceptable. Railways needed to be controllable, needed to depend on fuel supplies that could be restricted or cut off. The military advantage of dependence from governmental control perspective outweighed the performance advantages of electrical independence, so governments actively suppressed the superior technology to maintain controllable infrastructure. The patents and technical literature show the knowledge didn't die as a... Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, inventors repeatedly tried to revive atmospheric electric railways, filed patents for collection systems, published technical papers demonstrating feasibility, built experimental systems proving the principles worked. And every attempt faced systematic obstacles. Patents were granted then, mysteriously classified. Technical papers were published in obscure journals, then vanished from later compilations. Experimental systems were denied permission to connect to public rail networks. Inventors lost funding or faced suspicious accidents. The suppression wasn't just a historical event that happened once, was ongoing campaign against every attempt to recover the technology. A campaign that continues today whenever anyone proposes transportation systems that would be truly energy independent. The few modern researchers who examine the historical evidence face the same academic gatekeeping we've documented elsewhere. Papers proposing that 19th-century electric railways existed before official history acknowledges them are rejected as pseudo-history. Archaeological evidence of electrical infrastructure along early rail lines is dismissed as misinterpreted remnants of telegraphic systems despite the construction being completely different. The technical documents from the 1830s and 1840s describing electrical systems are labeled as fantasies or frauds despite being official government survey records. The academic establishment cannot acknowledge that electric railways operated decades before supposed invention, because doing so would require explaining why superior technology was abandoned in favor of inferior steam systems. Would require acknowledging that technological development included deliberate suppression, not just natural evil. That acknowledgement threatens to many assumptions about progress and about the benevolence of institutions that shaped industrial development. The recovery potential exists, but faces institutional barriers designed to prevent it. Modern materials and manufacturing could build atmospheric collection systems more efficiently than 1830s technology. Modern electrical engineering could optimize the power collection and transmission better than historical systems. We could absolutely build rail networks that power themselves from atmospheric electricity. Could eliminate the massive power consumption of modern electric rail systems that draw from fossil fuel-powered grids. Could create genuinely sustainable transportation requiring no external energy inputs. The technical knowledge exists. The principles are proven. What's missing is institutional permission to implement technology that would eliminate profitable energy dependencies. The economic interests opposing recovery are enormous and obvious. Electric utilities selling power to rail systems, fossil fuel companies supplying power generation, the entire centralized energy distribution infrastructure, all threatened by transportation systems that could power themselves. The combined revenue of these industries exceeds trillions annually. They have unlimited resources to prevent recovery of technology threatening their business models, have political influence to block regulatory approval, have media control to ridicule and marginalize anyone proposing atmospheric electric railways, have academic influence to prevent serious research. The suppression mechanisms that worked in the 1860s work today with evolved tools but identical strategy. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what you need to understand is that every time you see modern electric trains drawing power from overhead wires connected to fossil fuel power plants, you're witnessing the victory of a 170-year suppression campaign and the ongoing prevention of technology that could provide truly sustainable transportation. The comparative analysis is damning. Modern high-speed rail systems are impressive engineering achievements, but they require massive infrastructure investment in electrification, require enormous ongoing power consumption from centralized grids, create dependencies on power generation systems that overwhelmingly use fossil fuels, cost billions to construct and billions to operate. Yet atmospheric electric railways using Tartarian principles would require similar track construction but vastly simpler electrification, would require collection arrays costing fraction of overhead wire systems, would operate with zero ongoing fuel costs, would be genuinely sustainable, requiring only maintenance, not continuous energy inputs. We could have superior technology, could have had it for 170 years, but we don't, because the technology was deliberately suppressed and recovery remains deliberately prevented. The student railways that briefly existed showed the technology worked even in miniature. Several universities in the 1890s built experimental electric railways using atmospheric collection for educational purposes, successfully demonstrated power collection and transmission, successfully operated small electric trains without external power sources, published results showing the principles were sound and scalable. Then had their systems shut down under pressure from railway companies and coal interests, who recognized even educational demonstrations threatened profitable monopolies. The few surviving photographs and technical reports document that the systems worked exactly as claimed, worked well enough that they had to be eliminated, even when they were just academic experiments, because successful demonstration threatened narrative control. The modern suppression includes preventing even discussion of the possibility. Search for information about 19th century electric railways, and you find only references to the 1879 Siemens demonstration and later systems. Search for atmospheric electricity collection for transportation and you find nothing but fringe websites dismissed as pseudoscience. The information control is comprehensive, ensures that even asking the questions makes you seem irrational, ensures that researchers don't pursue investigation because preliminary searches suggest there's nothing to investigate. The historical evidence is hidden in archives that researchers don't know to examine. The archaeological evidence is misinterpreted because the framework for understanding it as electrical infrastructure doesn't exist in mainstream archaeology. The suppression works through making the truth literally unthinkable by controlling information, access, and interpretive frameworks. We ride on railways that could be powered by atmospheric electricity collected through simple metal arrays. We accept massive energy consumption and environmental damage as necessary for electric rail systems when the energy is freely available in the atmosphere and collection. Technology existed 170 years ago. We believe we're using cutting-edge sustainable transportation when we're actually using deliberately crippled systems designed to maintain profitable energy dependencies. The Tartarian electric railways of the 1830s were superior to modern electric rail systems in energy independence. Operational costs and environmental sustainability were eliminated not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. Because they provided independence that industrial capitalism required elimination of, because they threatened to allow transportation without controllable fuel dependencies. The evidence survived in survey maps and construction records and archaeological remnants and fragmentary technical documents. Survived despite comprehensive suppression because bureaucracies preserve paperwork and physical infrastructure doesn't completely disappear. And some engineers and historians couldn't bring themselves to destroy truth entirely even while participating in suppressing it. We can recover the knowledge now, can examine the evidence, can recognize that electric railways existed decades before official invention, can understand that they were deliberately eliminated, can see that recovery remains deliberately prevented, and can begin asking why we accept inferior technology that creates dependencies, when superior technology providing independence was documented, demonstrated, and systematically suppressed specifically to prevent the liberation it would enable. The trains could run on lightning we don't harvest, on atmospheric charge differential that exists continuously but which we're taught can't power anything practical, on energy so abundant and freely available that accessing it would eliminate the trillion. Industry is built on making us pay for power. The Tartarians knew this, built railways, using it, operated transportation networks, requiring no fuel for decades before the technology was forcibly eliminated and replaced with systems requiring coal and later oil and later centralized electrical grids. The suppression of atmospheric electric railways wasn't just about transportation, was about ensuring populations would remain energy dependent, would require purchasing power from centralized suppliers, would never achieve the independence that free atmospheric electricity would provide. The trains that needed no coal weren't impossible, weren't fantasies, were real, were documented, were operating successfully, and were eliminated specifically because they worked too well. And we still don't have them, not because we can't build them, but because we're not allowed to. Remember, they already existed.